The roar of the crowd thundered across the arena. Tens of thousands of voices merged into one, echoing through stone arches, shaking the air like a storm. The Colosseum was alive, not with joy, but with bloodlust. Beneath the blazing sun, sand was stained red, each grain carrying the memory of death. To the Romans above, this was glory. To the men below, it was survival. They called them heroes. They called them champions. But the truth was far darker. Most gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals condemned to die. Chains marked their wrists long before they touched a sword. They did not choose to fight. They were chosen, forced into an arena where the price of disobedience was death. The cheers of the people masked the agony of the enslaved. Rome told its citizens that this was honor. In reality, it was torment disguised as entertainment. Imagine the moment before the gates open. The smell of sweat and iron filled the tunnels. Torches flickered, casting shadows on walls damp with centuries of suffering. Behind heavy doors, men waited, hearts pounding, knowing they were about to face beasts, blades, or each other. Some whispered prayers to gods who never answered. Others stood silent, resigned to their fate. The sound of the crowd seeped into the stone, a tidal wave of voices demanding blood. When the gates creaked open, daylight poured in like fire. The gladiator stepped forward, blinded, his feet sinking into sand already wet with blood. Above him, thousands of eyes fixed on his body, hungry for the spectacle. To the crowd, he was not a man. He was a pawn, a sacrifice, a living vessel for Rome's craving. Each strike, each wound, was not his own. It belonged to the empire. This was not combat. It was theater. The gladiator's pain was the script, his body the stage. Every cry, every drop of blood, every shattered bone reminded the audience that Rome was powerful, eternal, untouchable. Victory did not belong to the fighter. It belonged to the empire that forced him to fight. And yet, the most brutal truth of all was hidden not in the sand, but in what came before. For long before the crowd roared, long before the gates opened, these men endured a life of cruelty that stripped them of freedom, dignity, and hope. The arena was only the final act. The story of their torment began much earlier, in the dark halls of training camps, where chains and whips shaped men into weapons. The world remembers gladiators as icons of strength, men who stood tall against impossible odds, warriors immortalized in marble and myth. But the reality was far more brutal. Gladiators were not volunteers of glory. They were prisoners, slaves, and the condemned. Their lives were bought, sold, and controlled long before the crowd ever learned their names. Many came from the fringes of Rome's empire: Gauls, Thracians, Dacians, tribes crushed beneath the legions. Captured in war, they were paraded through the streets as spoils of conquest, then dragged into the training schools called ludi. For Rome, they were trophies of victory. For the men themselves, it was the start of a slow death. Others were criminals, judged unworthy of freedom and condemned to the sand. Some had stolen, others had rebelled. But once marked for the arena, their crimes no longer mattered. Their punishment was the same: chains, whips, and the certainty that their blood would entertain the masses. Even free men occasionally joined, desperate for coin or driven by hunger. But those few were exceptions, swallowed quickly by the same machinery of cruelty that consumed everyone else. Inside the ludi, the truth became unavoidable. The gladiator was not a warrior in the service of honor. He was property, branded, beaten and bound, his identity stripped away. His name could be changed. His fate could be sealed with a signature on a wax tablet. The lanista, the trainer and owner, became his master. And in the eyes of Roman law, his life was worth less than the weapons he carried. Daily existence was shaped by discipline and violence. From dawn until dusk, gladiators were drilled in combat, forced to master swords, spears, nets, and shields. But training was not only about skill, it was about obedience. A disobedient fighter was not corrected with words. He was lashed until flesh split open. He was shackled in darkness without food or water. Some were executed in front of their comrades as a warning. The message was clear. Fight when ordered, die when commanded, and never forget you are owned. Yet Rome cloaked this brutality in spectacle. They called the games munera, duties to honor the dead or appease the gods. But for the men dragged into the arena, it was never about duty. It was survival. Each match was a gamble. Win and live to fight again. Lose and collapse into the sand, just another body to be dragged away. The crowd cheered, believing they witnessed courage. But the courage was forced, wrung out by chains and fear. What Rome rarely admitted was that the arena was designed not only for entertainment, but for control. By turning human suffering into spectacle, the empire reminded its people of its absolute power. Every drop of blood spilled beneath the sun was a message carved into the heart of the city. Rome decides who lives and who dies. And the gladiator, enslaved, degraded, disposable, was the perfect vessel for that message. This was the reality behind the myth. Gladiators were not champions of freedom. They were instruments of fear, tools of empire, living sacrifices to the crowd's insatiable hunger. Their pain fed Rome. Their deaths strengthened its image. And the more the people cheered, the deeper the cruelty became. But if daily life in the ludi was harsh, what awaited those who resisted was even worse. For rebellion inside the camps was punished with punishments so cruel, so calculated, that even the strongest men broke. And in those punishments, we see the true brutality of Rome's gladiatorial system. If the Colosseum was the stage, the training camps, the ludi, were the factories of suffering. Behind their high walls, the myth of the gladiator was forged, not through honor or choice, but through relentless discipline, hunger, and pain. This was not a school. It was a prison designed to grind men down until obedience replaced defiance, until flesh bent to iron. The day began before sunrise. The guards thundered through corridors, dragging men into the yards. The first sound was not cheers, but the crack of whips striking skin that dared move too slowly. Gladiators trained with wooden swords, deliberately heavier than steel, each swing straining muscles until exhaustion blurred vision. Hours passed under the burning sun or in the stifling dark of enclosed halls. Sweat dripped, backs ached, and still the drills continued. There was no rest, no reprieve. To falter was to invite punishment. Food was sparse and functional. Barley gruel, beans, bread, fuel to keep them alive but never strong enough to resist. Meat was rare, reserved for matches that demanded spectacle. Water was rationed, and those who begged for more often found a lash across their backs. The lanista, master of the camp, controlled every detail, when they ate, when they trained, when they slept, even when they were allowed to breathe freely. To him, gladiators were investments, not men, and like cattle, they were kept under constant watch. The camp itself was built like a fortress. High walls, iron gates, and guards stationed at every corner. Escape was nearly impossible. Those who tried found themselves dragged back in chains, paraded before their comrades, and punished in ways that made death seem merciful. Some were crucified outside the walls, left to rot as a warning. Others were thrown into the arena prematurely, unarmed, forced to face beasts while their fellow trainees watched in silence. The lesson was clear. Defiance had no reward. But cruelty was not only punishment, it was woven into the rhythm of daily life. Men were pitted against each other in mock battles, forced to fight until one collapsed. Friends became rivals. Rivals became enemies. Trust was a luxury the lanista could not allow. Brotherhood threatened order. Isolation kept men obedient. Even when camaraderie formed, it was shattered with a single command: fight the man beside you, or suffer the lash together. The air in the ludi was thick with despair. Torches flickered against damp stone walls, shadows dancing like silent executioners. At night, the screams of the punished echoed across the barracks. Sleep offered no peace, only dreams filled with chains and fire. Some men prayed for death before ever stepping into the Colosseum. Others grew numb, hollow shells shaped into weapons. And yet, for Rome, this cruelty was necessity. Only through relentless control could gladiators be transformed into instruments of spectacle. Their fear was the foundation of their obedience. Their suffering was the cost of Rome's entertainment. Every drop of sweat spilled in the training yard was a rehearsal for the blood soon demanded in the arena. The ludi was not merely preparation, it was indoctrination. The men who entered its gates were stripped of identity, molded into living sacrifices. When they emerged, they did not walk as men. They marched as property, ready to die for a crowd that would never remember their names. But the punishments did not end in training, for the harshest discipline awaited those who survived their first battles. And in those moments, when blood soaked the sand and victory was no guarantee of freedom, the true nightmare of the gladiator's existence revealed itself. If training ground discipline was harsh, punishment for defiance was far worse. The ludi were not schools of honor. They were cages of fear, and fear was enforced with brutality. Rome understood that gladiators, though enslaved, were dangerous. They were strong, armed, and desperate. The only way to control them was to break their bodies and their spirits until rebellion itself seemed impossible. The lash was the first weapon of discipline. A whip of leather, tipped with bone or metal, tore flesh with every strike. Men were flogged until their backs resembled raw wounds, each line a reminder that resistance had no place within the walls. Sometimes they were bound to posts, whipped until they collapsed unconscious. When they woke, the lesson began again. Chains were another constant. Prisoners who disobeyed found themselves shackled in darkness, left without food or water, their cries echoing off damp stone. Hours turned into days. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Thirst clawed at their throats. Rats scurried across the floor, gnawing at sores and open wounds. When the doors finally opened, they emerged gaunt, broken, and obedient, or never emerged at all. More public punishments were reserved for greater defiance. A gladiator who struck a guard, who tried to flee, or who incited rebellion was made into a spectacle. Sometimes they were crucified outside the ludi, nailed to wooden beams where vultures picked at their bodies, while their comrades were marched past. Other times they were executed in the arena, stripped of weapons, thrown before beasts as living warnings. The message was clear. Rome owned not only your life, but also your death. Yet the cruelest punishment was psychological. Gladiators were often forced to execute their own companions. Two men who had trained together, eaten together, even whispered of freedom together, were suddenly ordered to fight to the death. To refuse was to suffer. To obey was to lose a piece of humanity. Each death carved a wound deeper than any blade, reminding survivors that even friendship could be turned into a weapon of control. For those marked as hopeless, Rome devised other horrors. Some were branded on the face, iron seared into flesh. The mark of disgrace burned forever into skin. Others were mutilated, their ears cut, their fingers broken, their dignity shredded piece by piece. Punishment was not always final. Sometimes it was worse to live marked, shamed, and broken than to die quickly. But perhaps the most chilling cruelty was the false promise of mercy. Occasionally, a gladiator was told that obedience could win freedom, that enough victories could earn a wooden sword, the rudis, symbol of release. Many believed, many endured, but for most it was a lie. Few ever left the arena alive, and fewer still left with honor. The hope of freedom was another chain, invisible but binding, keeping men fighting long after their will had shattered. Rome perfected punishment as art. It was not random cruelty. It was calculated, deliberate, and designed to crush rebellion before it began. By breaking one, they controlled hundreds. By displaying pain, they fed the machine of fear. Gladiators were not only fighters. They were lessons, living warnings etched in blood and screams. And yet, even the most brutal punishments could not erase the truth. For when the gates of the Colosseum opened and the crowd roared, the spectacle demanded more than obedience. It demanded blood. And in that sand, Rome revealed the darkest face of its empire, a theater where cruelty became entertainment and death became celebration. The Colosseum was not simply an arena. It was Rome itself, carved in stone, a monument to power, control, and the spectacle of cruelty. Seated within its towering walls, 50,000 voices merged into one, a chorus of hunger that demanded only blood. The emperors knew this truth well. Bread fed the body, but blood fed the empire. And so the games continued, day after day, year after year, until the very sand seemed soaked with memory. The design of the arena was deliberate. Beneath the floor stretched labyrinthine tunnels, cages where men and beasts waited in darkness. The smell of sweat, fear, and raw flesh clung to the air. At a signal, trapdoors groaned open. Elevators hauled cages upward. The ground shook as lions and bears burst into the light, their roars mingling with the crowds. And into this nightmare stepped the gladiators, half-trained men forced to fight until their screams became part of the entertainment. Combat was rarely fair. One man armed with a trident and net was pitted against another with sword and shield. Sometimes a single gladiator faced multiple opponents, the crowd cheering as the odds bent toward death. Others were cast against animals, tigers clawing at flesh, elephants trampling bodies into dust. To the people above, this was theater. To those below, it was slaughter. The sand itself was a witness. It absorbed the blood of men too broken to rise. It muffled the cries of those begging for mercy. Slaves swept it clean between fights, covering crimson stains with a fresh layer, as if Rome could bury its sins beneath a thin skin of dust. But the stains always returned. Blood seeped deeper, darkening the ground, turning the floor into a graveyard that no shovel could erase. And yet, the cruelty was not only in combat, it was in the decision that followed. When a gladiator fell to his knees, wounded but alive, the crowd erupted with gestures. Thumbs up, thumbs down. The meaning debated, the symbolism clear. Life or death rested not in the fighter's hands, but in the whim of thousands. Some emperors played merciful, granting reprieve for entertainment's sake. Others reveled in finality, raising a finger that condemned a man to the blade. For the gladiator, victory meant survival. Defeat meant humiliation, agony, and often death delivered slowly before a roaring audience. The Colosseum was Rome's theater of control. Each battle reminded citizens of their empire's might. Each execution reaffirmed that Rome's power extended over every body, every breath. The games were propaganda disguised as entertainment, cruelty packaged as honor. And the crowd loved it. They demanded more, their hunger insatiable, their cheers drowning the last gasps of dying men. But even amidst the spectacle, darker truths lurked. Not all deaths came from fair combat. Some were staged executions, criminals thrown unarmed against beasts, or condemned men set ablaze as living torches. These were not contests. They were rituals, sacrifices offered to keep Rome entertained and subdued. The gladiator's struggle was real, but the outcome was often predetermined. The sand carried more deception than honor. This was the brutal truth of the arena. Glory was an illusion. Behind the cheers lay only pain. Behind the spectacle lay only suffering. The Colosseum was not built to honor life. It was built to consume it. And yet, Rome's cruelty did not end with the battles themselves. For when the games sought to shock, the empire turned to spectacles even more horrific. Death staged not as combat, but as theater of pure torture. And in those moments, the Colosseum became darker than any dungeon. If the arena was a theater, then not every act was combat. Some were darker, staged not as contests of skill, but as elaborate executions meant to shock the crowd and remind them of Rome's absolute power. These were the spectacular. Rituals of death so cruel, so carefully choreographed, that they blurred the line between punishment and performance. Criminals, rebels, and prisoners of war were often the victims. They were not armed like gladiators. They were not trained for survival. They were props in Rome's bloody pageant. The crowd did not come to see them fight. They came to see them die. And die they did in ways designed to be unforgettable. One of the most feared punishments was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. A gate would open, and lions, leopards, or bears would burst forth, starved and furious. The condemned, naked, and unarmed, could do nothing but scream as claws tore flesh and jaws, ripped bones apart. The crowd erupted, not in pity, but in delight. To them it was justice, entertainment, and divine retribution all at once. Other executions took a more theatrical form. Sometimes prisoners were dressed as mythological figures, Orpheus, Prometheus, or Hercules, and forced to reenact their legendary deaths. A man playing Orpheus might be mauled by a bear, while one cast as Prometheus was chained as vultures picked at his body. These were not plays. They were living sacrifices staged as stories, turning pain into art and agony into allegory. Burning was another spectacle. Men were bound to stakes, their bodies doused in oil. Torches held high until flames consumed them. The fire roared, the smoke billowed, the stench of burning flesh filled the air. The condemned shrieked, twisted, and collapsed, their bodies collapsing into ash while the crowd cheered as if celebrating a festival. To Rome, it was not horror. It was theater with fire as the script and human beings as the actors. Some executions involved crucifixion. Prisoners were nailed to wooden crosses erected in the arena, left to hang for hours, even days. The sun blistered their skin, thirst cracked their lips, birds circled overhead, pecking at open wounds. The audience watched as life drained away inch by inch, turning suffering into slow-motion entertainment. The cross, symbol of humiliation and agony, became another stage prop in Rome's arsenal of terror. Yet Rome's cruelty went further still. There are accounts of men being sewn into animal skins, then thrown to dogs who tore them apart, mistaking them for prey. Others were forced to fight armed gladiators while blindfolded, stumbling helplessly until the sword found its mark. Death was never quick. It was prolonged, exaggerated, designed to stretch every gasp, every cry, into a memory for the masses. What made these executions most chilling was not only their brutality, but their acceptance. Families brought children to watch. Senators and emperors applauded. Priests blessed the rituals. Pain was normalized, suffering transformed into a civic event. The Colosseum was not merely a place of blood. It was a classroom, teaching Rome that cruelty was strength, that violence was order, that fear was the foundation of empire. For the condemned, there was no escape. Whether torn apart by beasts, burned alive, or nailed to wood, their deaths were certain, their agony guaranteed. They were stripped not only of life but of dignity, reduced to spectacle for a crowd too vast to remember their names. And yet, even amid such horrors, one figure remained central, the gladiator. Unlike criminals or prisoners, his death carried a different weight. He was trained, armed, forced to fight for survival. He was entertainment refined, pain sharpened into art. And his fate, hanging on the whim of a crowd's gesture, revealed the darkest paradox of Rome, that even heroes of the arena were nothing more than expendable tools in an endless cycle of blood. But the story of the gladiator's death does not end in the arena. For the rituals surrounding defeat, humiliation, execution, and the cruel theater of the emperor's mercy carry truths far more brutal than the fight itself. For the gladiator, death was not always immediate. It was a process, a performance, and often a humiliation. Survival in the arena depended not only on skill or luck, but on the whims of the emperor and the mood of the crowd. Life and death balanced on a gesture, a thumb raised or lowered, a signal that could extinguish a man in an instant. The fallen gladiator knelt in the sand, blood dripping from wounds, his weapon lost or broken. Around him the roar of the crowd swelled like a tidal wave. Thousands of voices demanded judgment, their cries echoing across stone. Some shouted for mercy, others for death. The emperor, seated high above, watched with practiced indifference. His decision was not about justice, it was about spectacle. To spare a man was to delight the audience. To kill him was to remind them of Rome's absolute power. If condemned, the ritual was swift but cruel. Another gladiator would approach, sword poised. The defeated man was expected to bare his chest, to accept the blade with dignity. Sometimes he was forced to lift his chin, eyes meeting the emperor's as steel pierced his body. The strike was aimed at the heart, but not always true. Death could come in seconds or in minutes of writhing agony while the crowd roared approval. His body, once celebrated in combat, became a trophy of Rome's dominance. But humiliation extended beyond the blade. Some gladiators were dragged through the sand, their corpses paraded before the audience. Others were stripped naked, their remains dumped into pits or burned in heaps with criminals and beasts. In life, they had been cheered as warriors. In death, they were discarded like broken tools, their names vanished, their victories forgotten. What endured was only the memory of their suffering, etched into the minds of the crowd. The pollis verso, the turning of the thumb, has become legend. Artists and writers later romanticized it as the ultimate symbol of power. But for the gladiator, it was terror distilled into a single moment. He had no voice, no defense, no choice. His fate was decided by thousands who never knew his story, by a ruler who saw him as nothing more than entertainment. And for those spared, survival brought no freedom. Mercy meant another fight, another day of training, another cycle of torment. The wooden sword, the rudes that promised release, was given to only a rare few, often after decades of suffering. For most, the mercy of the emperor was merely a delay of the inevitable. What makes these deaths most haunting is the silence that followed. After the roar, after the blood, after the spectacle ended, the gladiator's body was removed quickly, the sand raked, the stains hidden beneath fresh dust. The crowd dispersed, their hunger satisfied for the day. But beneath the surface, the arena remembered. Every crimson drop remained, a silent testament to lives consumed and discarded for entertainment. This was the gladiator's truth. Death was not noble. It was humiliating, degrading, stripped of dignity and humanity. Rome celebrated their suffering, and when it was over, Rome erased them. Yet even in such cruelty, there were moments when gladiators resisted, when men refused to be broken by chains or spectacle. And in those rare sparks of defiance, Rome faced the one thing it feared most: rebellion. For Rome, gladiators were both spectacle and threat. They were slaves, yes, but unlike ordinary laborers, they were trained in combat, hardened by pain, and armed with knowledge of death. Behind their chains lay the possibility of something the empire feared above all: rebellion. And though most gladiators died in silence, a few found the strength to rise. And when they did, Rome trembled. The most infamous of these uprisings was led by Spartacus. In 73 BCE, he was a Thracian, once a soldier, captured and sold into the brutal life of a gladiator. Trained at the school of Capua, Spartacus endured the same lash, the same endless drills, the same humiliations as countless others. But where others bowed, he resisted. Along with 70 companions armed with kitchen knives and seized weapons, he broke free from the ludus, slipping past the guards and spilling into the Italian countryside. What began as a desperate flight grew into a war. Escaped gladiators and slaves flocked to Spartacus's banner. They looted Roman towns, seized weapons, and turned Rome's own tactics against it. Within months, his ragged army swelled into tens of thousands. To the Senate, this was more than a revolt. It was a nightmare made real. The empire's own instruments of fear had become enemies, wielding the skills Rome had taught them. Spartacus and his army fought with ferocity. They crushed Roman legions sent to stop them, humiliated commanders, and carved a path through Italy. For 2 years, they defied the empire, proving that gladiators, long dismissed as expendable tools, could shake the foundations of Rome itself. The Colosseum stage had spilled out into the open fields, and for once, the blood soaking the earth belonged not only to slaves, but to Rome soldiers. But rebellion carried its own cruelty. For every battle Spartacus won, Rome answered with terror. Captured slaves were crucified along the roads, their bodies left hanging for miles as warnings. Entire villages suspected of aiding the rebels were burned, their people slaughtered. Rome would not allow defiance to become legend. Fear had to be restored, no matter the cost. Eventually, Spartacus's rebellion was crushed. Surrounded and outnumbered, his forces were slaughtered in a final battle. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, their rotting bodies a grim procession stretching over 100 miles. The message was clear. Rome might bend, but it would never break. And the dream of freedom died screaming in the sun, yet the shadow of Spartacus remained. His name survived in whispers, in fear, in memory. Rome had silenced the uprising, but it could not erase the truth it revealed, that gladiators were not mere tools. They were men, men capable of resisting, of defying, of striking terror into the very heart of the empire. The fear of rebellion never left the arena. Guards grew harsher, punishments more severe, chains heavier. The ludi became fortresses, built not only to train fighters, but to contain them. Every lash, every execution, every drop of cruelty that followed was shaped by Rome's terror of another Spartacus. This was the paradox of the gladiator. Rome needed their blood to entertain, yet feared their strength to resist. The empire turned them into weapons, but dreaded the day those weapons pointed back at their masters. And still, even rebellion could not free them from the cycle of blood. For Rome had crafted an illusion so powerful that even defiance could not erase it. The myth of the gladiator, as hero, as champion, as spectacle, was already too deeply woven into the empire's soul. And in that myth lay the empire's greatest deception, one that has survived long after the last gladiator fell. Rome was a master of illusions. It knew how to dress cruelty in the robes of glory, how to mask slavery with the language of honor. No figure embodied this deception more than the gladiator. To the crowd, he was a hero, a warrior, a man who fought for glory and victory. But behind the spectacle, the reality was chains, punishment, and death. The empire crafted the myth carefully. Statues were raised of famous fighters, their muscles carved in marble, their names whispered like legends. Writers composed poems that praised their courage. Mosaics decorated villas with images of gladiators standing tall, weapons gleaming, triumphant over fallen foes. In the public eye, these men were celebrated, admired, even envied. They became symbols of strength, of masculinity, of Roman might itself. But the truth was more brutal. The gladiator's life was not freedom. It was bondage. His victories were not his own. They belonged to the empire. Even the most successful fighters, those rare few who survived long enough to win fame, were still slaves. They slept behind bars. They ate at the mercy of their masters. They lived under the constant threat of death. Their image was glorified, but their reality was dehumanized. Rome's manipulation served a purpose. By turning gladiators into heroes, the empire disguised its cruelty as entertainment. Citizens cheered for men whose lives were controlled from birth to death, never realizing or never caring that their admiration fed the very system that enslaved them. The more they glorified the gladiator, the less they questioned the blood soaking the sand. Even the promise of freedom was twisted into myth. The wooden sword, the rudis, was hailed as a symbol of triumph, proof that skill and courage could buy liberty. But in truth, only a handful ever received it. The vast majority died long before freedom was possible. The Rudies was not a reward. It was bait, a hope dangled before men who would almost never taste it. The myth also extended beyond Rome itself. Foreigners heard of the gladiators and imagined them as noble champions. Merchants told stories of their valor. Children pretended to be them in games. The empire exported not only its power, but its spectacle, weaving the gladiator into the very fabric of Roman identity. To doubt the glory of the arena was to doubt Rome itself. And so the deception endured. The people loved their heroes, but those heroes were shackled. They admired their courage, but that courage was forced. They celebrated their victories, but those victories were soaked in slavery and blood. The gladiator's image was a mirror, reflecting strength while hiding torment. This manipulation did more than entertain. It controlled. By glorifying violence, Rome normalized it. By celebrating slaves as heroes, it disguised their suffering. By making death appear noble, it taught its people to accept cruelty as a natural part of life. The myth of the gladiator was propaganda, and the people believed it. But myths cannot bury truth forever. For beneath the statues, beneath the mosaics, beneath the poetry, the blood remained. The sand remembered, the chains remembered, and the silence of the dead whispered louder than any cheer. The empire built its illusion on spectacle, but spectacle fades. What endures is the reality, the broken bodies, the tortured lives, the endless cycle of suffering that Rome tried to hide behind marble and song. And when the empire itself began to crumble, the myth of the gladiator outlived it. But the question remains, why does this myth still captivate us today? Why do we still look at the gladiator as a symbol of honor, when his true story was one of horror? The Roman Empire has long since fallen. The Colosseum lies in ruins, its arches cracked, its floor silent, its sand washed clean by centuries of rain. But though the stones crumble, the shadow of the gladiator has never disappeared. The myth, the spectacle, the hunger for blood, it lingers, alive in ways far closer to us than we might wish to believe. For centuries after the games ended, the memory of the arena haunted Europe. Kings and emperors staged tournaments, knights clashed before cheering crowds, and executions became public entertainment. The echoes of the Colosseum rolled forward in time, its lessons of fear and spectacle never truly forgotten. Even today, the fascination with the gladiator endures. Movies glorify their battles. Novels romanticize their courage. We still dress their chains in the language of honor, still turn their agony into art. But the legacy is not only in stories, it is in the way we watch violence. Stadiums fill with roaring voices, not unlike the Colosseum. Fighters step into cages and rings, their bodies tested, their pain consumed by millions as entertainment. We call it sport, not slaughter. But the line is thinner than we admit. The spectacle remains, though cloaked in rules, contracts, and modern lights. Rome may be gone, but the thirst that filled its arenas still burns. And the cruelty of control still endures. The idea that some lives are expendable for the entertainment of others, that suffering can be transformed into spectacle, that dignity can be stripped away in the name of power, these are not relics of the past. They are patterns woven deep into human history. The gladiator may have died centuries ago, but the system that created him never truly vanished. The Colosseum taught Rome more than how to cheer. It taught them how to accept cruelty, how to disguise it as honor, how to normalize the sight of pain. That lesson has echoed across time, resurfacing in prisons and wars, in the quiet corners of the modern world where suffering is hidden but never gone. The myth comforts us. The reality warns us. And the warning has never been more urgent. For when we look back on the Gladiator, we do not only see Rome, we see ourselves. We see the hunger for spectacle, the fascination with violence, the willingness to turn human lives into entertainment. The sand may be gone, but the blood has never dried. And so the final question remains, as chilling now as it was 2,000 years ago. Has humanity truly left the arena behind? Or has the arena simply changed shape, waiting for us in ways we have yet to recognize?